Has anyone ever written a book and felt both that all of the words came pouring out of you at once and the world was coming alive, but also that you were progressing through the story like it was made out of molasses? Like you're writing really fast and you're feeling really productive, but when you look at your overall story progress, you are at the midpoint when you should be nearing the end? Have you felt that it just takes forever to get through scenes and that every scene you write is between 5,000 and 6,000 words and scenes just can't get shorter than that? And then when you go to edit your book, you're just constantly trimming stuff out of it because you write descriptions that are too long? Because same. This is me. I do this all the time, and this is something that's called overwriting. Overwriting happens when a writer uses too much language to describe things in a story. They write descriptions that are too long or sentences that are too long, and this negatively impacts the clarity and sharpness of your writing. It also leads to fun, quirky things like your drafts being twice as long as they should be and taking twice as long to write. Overwriting has been very frustrating for me because I have had to not only take a lot more time drafting than I would otherwise have to take, but I would have to cut all of this stuff that I'd written into the book out of the manuscript after I was done drafting during the editing stage. So not only did the drafting stage take longer, but the editing stage also took longer. So I've had to do a lot of thinking to figure out how to combat overwriting when I am drafting and writing myself. And today I'm going to share with you some things that work for me to fix overwriting or correct myself before I have written the world's longest manuscript. But before we get started, hello and welcome. My name is Claire Fraze, and I'm an award-winning young adult author who makes videos on this channel sharing actionable writing tips that helped me make my own writing better. I am the author of the young adult paranormal thriller They Stay series, including books They Stay, They Whisper, They Return, and I'm currently working on book 4. And I also published my debut novel when I was 16, so if you are a teen writer who is looking to publish a book, I have made many videos on this channel sharing about that experience. I make videos reviewing craft resources, explaining different concepts in ways that really clicked in my brain, and interviewing different authors. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video, and let's just get into it. So why does overwriting happen in the first place? I have a tendency to overwrite when I'm exploring in my drafts, and I am trying to figure out what things look like or how things feel or just generally what it feels like to be a character in that scene. And so I use a lot of language to try to write myself into that place. And then when I'm editing later, I realize I don't need all that language because I've figured out the scene, and then I trim it all down. I lay it on thick when trying to describe emotions and moods and character arcs and places and what things look like. But this kind of overkill description can have a negative impact on your reader, who can lose sight of the story and get lost in your constant long descriptions of things. And you also oftentimes repeat yourself when you're writing that much, and so your reader can get bored of that too. You, as a writer, want to convey things as succinctly as possible while also making them 3D and conveying the emotional reality that you want to the reader. You want your worlds to be rich and you want them to be immersive, but you don't want to do that in more words than is necessary. So I'm really bad about overwriting in my initial drafts, like really bad. And I implemented 2 strategies and rules for myself that have really helped me cut my drafts down. My initial draft for book 3 of my series was, I think, 90,000 words by the time I'd barely even reached the midpoint. I hadn't written the midpoint climax yet. And my current draft, I'm on chapter 40, and I am, I think, 80 or 90,000 words in. My draft of book 4 is going to be a way more manageable size than my draft for book 3, which is good because a lot of the scenes that I wrote for book 4 are terrible and not going to end up in the book, or they're just not the plot that's going to end up in the book. Like the conversation that these 2 characters have is going to be thrown in the trash and replaced with a completely new conversation because the plot has to go in a different direction. The first thing that I did that helped me with this was set word count caps for every single chapter that I write. I target 2,500 words for every chapter in a first draft. I write mysteries and thrillers, and so I like to have this sort of fast-paced movement through my story. If you wrote like epic fantasy, this might not work as well. But in my first drafts, I see the 1250 mark as being the halfway, midpoint in my chapter. So I know that by that point, things have to have shifted or something has to happen to change things up a little bit. And then by the 2,000 word mark in a chapter, I have to be hitting the climax of that chapter. So I'm better able to feel out where I am in a chapter, and it's a lot more manageable for me to write them because I can write multiple chapters like that in a day instead of like write 3,000 words and be only halfway through a chapter and just throw in the towel. This is letting me progress way faster through my story. If you wanted to do something similar, you're gonna have to play around and see what word counts work best for you. This was a giant experiment for me, but it worked really well. And the second thing that I did that really helped me was not stressing about prose at all. By not worrying about prose, I'm able to move through my story a lot faster. I like to treat prose like a personal tool that I use to look and explore through my story, almost like they're like my archaeological tools. I don't think about it like I'm trying to write something very good that is going to be read by other people. I only think about it like I need to figure out where these characters are, what they look like, what they're feeling, and how they move through this story. And once I figure that out using all the words that I want to, then I can think about my prose more in draft 2. This takes a lot of pressure off and doesn't make me feel like I am performing as much, so there's not this stress that I need to make everything sound good. And so I have not only more fun writing draft 1, but I also move through it faster. But if I get to the end of a draft and I found a chapter has been really overwritten, here are 5 things that I do to edit all of that stuff out. First, I focus on the details that contribute to the scene. Does every single color of every single object in a room need to be described? No. But if a scarf a character is wearing is a specific color, and a scarf of that color appears at the scene of a crime later in the story, then that scarf is suddenly very important. You can't include every single detail of a description. You need to choose the things that enhance the emotional reality of your scene, and also select things that your characters would notice or would be important to them. Let's say you're writing a scene in a police station and your character has just been arrested and they're at a police station. It doesn't matter what color the wall is or what the wall was made out of, but it does matter if the wall is really thick and if it feels oppressive, like it's suffocating that character and trapping them. You want to include details that show the reader how your character is feeling. So think about what they would notice in that scene. Would your character probably notice what font the numbers in the clock were written in? No, but they would probably notice if the clock was ticking really loudly. They would notice the sound of the door closing heavily. They would notice if a police officer had a bored look on their face, like they didn't really want to be there. Not everything is important, so you can't treat everything with the same importance. Think about your scene, think about your character in your scene, think about what you want your scene to convey to the reader, and choose details and description around that. You can delete the rest of the stuff. I really like to think about this when describing characters. Instead of rattling off every single little tiny detail about a person's face, choose like your top 3 things that you want your readers to picture when picturing that character and use those descriptions consistently. Think about traits that reflect a part of their personality, or if they have any really like specific physical quirks that are important to the story, make sure you describe those. Don't, rattle off how many freckles they have, their eye color, their hair color, their nose shape, their ear shape. Don't do paragraphs upon paragraphs of description. Just do a short paragraph explaining and trying to paint a very clear picture of the most important elements of a character that are going to be the most visual and help the reader picture them. My second tip for correcting overwriting is be aware of the phrases that you overuse. I have a running list of these words that are problem words for me, and I go through and I cut as many of them as possible from my final drafts. By doing this, I still have them in there, but I have gotten rid of a lot of them and have made it so that my readers stop paying attention to them and stop being able to see them. Every person has a different list of crutch words, and you would be amazed by how many words this cuts out of your manuscript. My third tip is to trim the fat. This is part of a later editing pass I do. This is not the first thing I do to my manuscript when I start editing. This is closer to the end of my process. I usually do this after I've taken a little bit of time away from the manuscript. I publish on a pretty tight schedule for me, so I don't have that much time for this, but sometimes I'll try to take a week and just distance myself from it. And then I go and I put the manuscript in a new font, or I format it so I can look at it like it's the formatted version of the book. And I delete so much stuff. I literally deleted 20,000 words of just this stuff from They Return 2 weeks before it came out. What exactly am I cutting? I'm cutting repetition. I'm cutting redundancies. I'm cutting unnecessary dialogue tags. I have so many of those. Places where I tell versus show emotions. Really long descriptions. All of these things are things that slow me down as I'm moving through the manuscript. If it's a conversation between two people and it's very clear who's talking to who, I don't need to have a dialogue tag or an action tag for every single line of dialogue. It's clear that they're going back and forth. When I'm looking at my manuscript with fresh eyes, it's very easy to see if I've repeated a description like 2 pages later that I've already just stated. Sometimes I'll have these really long paragraphs that go on about, a character's emotional state that might not exactly be written in their voice. That just feels like telling to me. I will just cut that. I don't have a list for this. This is just an intrinsic sense that I have developed over my years of writing and practicing. So what I would recommend doing is, first of all, reading a lot, because by reading you start to get an internal flow for how books are supposed to feel and how books are supposed to hear, especially if you're listening to audiobooks. I find that helps me a lot with just reading my book and being able to tell whether a line is needed or not. I also recommend reading a lot of other people's work and critiquing it. Like if you're part of a writing group or a critique group, that has helped me so much. But don't be afraid to cut when you're an overwriter. When you're an underwriter, this is a different thing because maybe you haven't fleshed out your prose as much as it needs to be. But sometimes when you're an overwriter, you flesh it out too much. So trimming your words down can really help clarify your scenes and make them so the readers don't get as lost in all of the mountains of prose. One other thing that I found helpful is using strong verbs. This is not going to make any crazy monumental difference on whether you overwrite or not, but it does get rid of some redundancies, like instead of saying very angry, you can say livid. You have to be a little cautious when you're writing from first person present tense because you want to make sure all the language you're using is in that character's voice. I actually fell into a lot of overwriting trouble when I was writing from the point of view of one of my characters who goes on a lot of anxious rambles. Like he gets really worried about something and he will just brain dump and won't be able to stop talking, and he just works himself up into these emotional anxiety tizzies. And so my chapters for him were always so long, and I would just have to trim and trim and trim and trim because all of his nervous rambling was not moving the story forward. And so I would have to have a couple of sentences of nervous rambling to show that he's really nervous and then get on with the scene. And the fifth and final thing is be sure to leave things up to the reader's imagination. It's not your job as the author to bog your readers down with descriptions of every single detail in your story. You want to give them enough to string their hat on, but allow them to come up with their own individual picture of your setting and story. So give them enough to guide them. Like you don't want to give them nothing when you're describing, a giant haunted castle. You want to make sure they know it's a haunted castle, but you don't need to describe every single little tiny thing about it. Make sure they know it's scary, make sure they know your characters are scared, give them a couple of strong images, maybe the gargoyles or some moat going around the castle and the water sloshing around, but you don't have to tell them the color of every single gargoyle and whether some are chipped and some are not and where the chips are on the gargoyles, because that's just going to get boring. I didn't mention this so far in the video, so let's just call this a bonus sixth tip, is write active description and show your character moving through a place. Don't dump all of the description on your readers right at the beginning. Maybe show a couple of sentences of description and then describe more as your characters move through the place. Like if it is a haunted house, describe the general broad stroke haunted house at the beginning. And then as they walk through the door, you can describe the creaky door, the creaky hinges, and then they walk inside and they pick something up. And then what is that thing that they're picking up? And then maybe it's dusty, they have dust on their hands, and there's this weird noise out, upstairs somewhere, and they hear the noise. Not all of your description has to happen at the beginning. So that's it for this video on overwriting and the strategies I recommend for overcoming it. I hope that it was helpful to you. If it was, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more videos like this, sharing the actionable writing tips that helped me make my own writing better. Are you an overwriter? If so, do you agree with my tips? Or are there other things that have helped you when learning how to fix overwriting? Comment down below with your strategies to overcome overwriting. I love hearing from you and what works for you, and what works for me is not going to work for every writer. And so it's super awesome when you share your own writing process in the comments in case there's somebody else who stumbled upon it and finds something in there that would really help them. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have a fantastic week, and as always, happy writing.